time, I would like to welcome Dr. Coleman to the stage. Dr. Coleman is also a professor here at the University of New Mexico. I took my first class with him, Afrofuturism, and it changed my life. Dr. Coleman has been a pivotal role, has made an essential impact on my life, and I would just like to thank you.
I feel like the adult that takes the piece of cake from a kid at a birthday party right now, because I insisted on having the opportunity to introduce our speaker today. But before I do that, a couple things I want to mention. First, we also have Dean Tracy Collins with us. Yeah. Dean Patricia Finn is with us as well. And I believe we've recognized the Executive VP for the Health Sciences Center, Douglas Ziodonis. They're also here with us. And we will end this program and not have recognized everyone who's here today. So again, echoing what Kirsten said, thank you for all of you for being here today. Next week, on Thursday, Friday, Saturday, but Friday and Saturday in particular, the Langston Hughes Project will be making a return appearance to the University of New Mexico. Yeah, you can give it up for the Langston Hughes Project. And that was made possible by the support from the deans, but also from the provost and the office of the president. So thank you, Provost Holloway, and others who helped to make that program possible. And when I say made it possible, made it free of charge, so that all of you here, if you're here at the brunch today, you have automatic reserved seating for the Langston Hughes Project next Friday. All right? This is a Pope Joy Hall event. It'll be in Pope Joy Hall. Curtain is at 10 o'clock sharp. When you come in, just make sure that you let the ushers know that you are at the Black History Month brunch, and they will allow you to come down front for reserved seating. All right? On Saturday night, we will have a benefit concert for the benefit of scholarships for African American Student Services. That will be a partnership with Africana Studies, College of Fine Arts, the Provost, the Office of the President, with the African American Performing Arts Center. It'll be held there at 7 o'clock. Admission is free, but you will be given an envelope that you can drop your generous check in before you leave. And there'll be information there as to who to make checks out to and such. There will be an encore performance of the Langston Hughes Project at 4 o'clock on Friday at the African American Performing Arts Center. And hopefully some of you have seen some of the emails on that, but look for email blasts with additional information about that program. Really excited that they are going to be here on our campus. I've already kind of buttonholed the executive VP to help me with introductions, so I'm going to hold you to that, Dr. Ziodonis. Thank you. So, Adolph Reed, for all of us, and I say all of us who have any kind of standing in African American studies, African American literature, African American cultural history, it is very hard for you to have gotten to the place that you are in academia if you haven't gone by way of the school of Adolph Reed. When I think about courage, I think about several types of courage. The courage that you need to speak to your family, to speak the truth to the people who love you. That is a certain type of courage. And not all of us can have that courage that we need in those moments. There's another type of courage that you need to be able to talk to your community, to talk to the people that you live with and work with on a daily basis. That is a very different type of courage. But probably the most rare courage is not that courage that we talk about that you need to speak the truth to power. It's the courage that you need to tell the truth to the people that you love. In Adolph Reed, we have that courage in abundance. You can give a round of applause for that if you feel like it. We were fortunate some years ago to have Maya Angelou visit our campus, and a group of women were waiting outside of the door, outside of the green room, and they weren't going to be allowed in. And Maya Angelou was very tired, and she said, no, let these women in. And she spent a significant amount of time talking to them about courage. And that courage is that one thing that when you need it most might not be there. And that these women gave her courage. These were women who had founded the Maya Angelou House for battered and abused women in Denver. And that moment I realized that, yes, we have to thank those people who gave us courage. And Adolph Reed, thank you for giving all of us the courage that we've needed to do the kind of work that we've been vested in. Your voice is echoed throughout our institution. Whenever I'm in my conversations with the provost, as president of the Faculty Senate, whenever I'm talking with leadership here on campus, your voice is echoed there. So thank you so much for everything that you've done for us. When I think about Adolph Reed, I think about him in the same sentence, the same breath that I think about Marcus Garvey, that I think about Malcolm X, that I think about Adolph Reed. Thank you for joining us today. Please give a round of applause for our distinguished visitor, lecturer today, Dr. Adolph Reed, Jr.
Hi, I'm going to try to work with this. Can you hear me? Yes. Excellent. So I have to admit, like, I still don't take compliments very well. Like, I'm still kind of got too much of that Catholic boy, Lord, I am not worthy, Lord, I am not worthy in me. But I very much appreciate the welcome and the opportunity to spend some time talking today. So as I've said, I'm very happy and honored to be the keynote speaker to the 38th annual Kickoff Brunch for the University of New Mexico's celebration of African American History Month. I want to thank the Department of Africana Studies and the university's African American Student Services for inviting me. I want especially to thank Dr. Finney Coleman for that extravagant introduction. I hope I can live up to it. And I want to express my special gratitude to Professor Kirsten Pye Buick, who made it happen. She and I have been an intellectual mutual admiration society for so long that I didn't recall when or how it began, and she reminded me yesterday and she told you this morning, so that's great. Finally, I also want to take this opportunity to congratulate members of UE Local 1466, of the United Graduate Students here, who, along with UE Local 1448 at New Mexico State, just last month signed contracts with substantial improvements in pay and benefits or pay and working conditions. I don't know if there are any members in the room, but congratulations. And just as another plug, I'm going to be talking to to the international president of your union tomorrow on our podcast, classmatterspodcast.org, but it won't be ready for a while, but you can find the 10 previous issues online. And I will say one more thing about that this victory of those two locals is proof of what solidarity can accomplish. And I mention that partly because in some of my talk today, I'm going to be talking about just the opposite of what undoes solidarity. I think the way it popped into my head is that this is proof that there's nothing like solidarity, And I'm going to be talking about some stuff today that is, in fact, nothing at all like solidarity. Anyway, so my comments today are, I mentioned to Provost Holloway that they can be heard or read as something like a long amplification of some of his remarks. Right, I think the topic of memory is actually a pretty good place to start. Those who've read or listened to interviews about the South, it's here as a prop, know that it began out of an ongoing conversation around the turn of this century with some longtime friends and collaborators who also have personal links to the region during the Jim Crow era. The upshot of those conversations was recognition that our general age cohort were the youngest and soon to be the only people with living recollections of the Jim Crow order as everyday life, and that when our cohort passes from the stage of history, all such connection will be gone. That's what prompted me to begin writing with no clear end in mind, frankly, or with no other end, or with no clear end in mind except to leave a record. Some may also know that I've resisted fiercely, some might say obsessively, describing the book as a memoir, and maybe, well, I'll say more about that in a sec. What I'm sure is less clear is why. Why my friends, also professors and scholars who work at least partly on that period, and I, were so moved that direct knowledge of the segregation era would die with us, which is, after all, the experience of everyone who lives long enough to confront that moment. Why my immediate impulse was to write something, to leave a record, as though there weren't already many studies and personal reflections on the period already in existence, and why I've so militantly resisted calling the book a memoir. Some answers to those questions are generic, right? For example, when it's one's own cohort facing the inevitable, the shock of recognition makes it stand out that the cohort and oneself before long will persist only ephemerally in the increasingly remote recollections of others. If you largely contribute to a written scholarly record for a living, then the impulse to capture a sensibility and commit it to text is natural. And if one's inclination is to recoil from being the center of attention and to abhor whatever it might feel like preening self-display, then memoir is anathema as a genre, right? But there was more. We all fretted, based on trends then current in African Americanist historiography, and both academic and popular interpretations of the past, that prevailing ways of thinking about the Jim Crow era, and by extension Black American history and American history, were inadequate, in important ways simply wrong, and counterproductive. In the 2 decades or so since those what we were reacting to was, on one level, a tension between two fundamentally different approaches to conceptualizing the past and its relation to the present. One sees the link between past and present as generative. From that perspective, the present is connected to the past organically through a process not unlike evolution. Issues, struggles, and the questions or problems that animate them, and other developments that define earlier periods, contribute to producing the baseline social and political relations and sensibilities, norms, and frames of reference that shape subsequent periods, and so on. So, for example, making sense of contemporary Black political and intellectual life is enhanced, from this perspective, by situating it in relation to a trajectory that runs from defeat of Reconstruction and populism, emergence of a new stratum of professional men and women and their discourse and programs of racial uplift at the end of the 19th century, the Great Migration from South to North and to cities within the South, which also enabled a mass politics in the 1930s and 1940s, and an attendant tension between racial democratic and social democratic political norms and aspirations within that politics, eruption of the post-war civil rights movement, and the distinct but overlapping articulation of what would be understood as black interests in struggles for incorporation in governing coalitions in cities, in city politics, south and north, and the terms on which the victories of the civil rights movement in the in the 1960s would be consolidated institutionally. Examples of literature grounded in this perspective are Preston H. Smith's fine study, Racial Democracy and the Black Metropolis, Housing Policy in Post-War Chicago, and his very recent examination of the dynamics of black political incorporation in cities in the post-war period, focusing particularly on the years prior to Black Power and the Voting Rights Act. It's an essay titled Black Political Incorporation Under Neoliberalism, the Routinization of Interracial Urban Regimes, that just appeared in the journal Non-Site a little earlier this month. Teray F. Reed, Not Alms but Opportunity, the Urban League and the Politics of Racial Uplift, 1910 to 1950, and more recently, Toward Freedom, The Case Against Race Reductionism. Kenneth W. Warren, What Was African American Literature? Michelle Mitchell, who is, by the way, from Albuquerque. She grew up in Albuquerque. Righteous Propagation, African Americans and the Politics of Racial Destiny After Reconstruction. Cedric Johnson, Revolutionaries to Race Leaders, Black Power and the Making of African American Politics. Dean E. Robinson, Black Nationalism in American Politics and Thought. Kevin K. Gaines, Uplifting the Race, Black Leadership, Politics and Culture in the 20th Century. Michael Rudolph West, The Education of Booker T. Washington, American Democracy and the Idea of Race Relations. And Judith Stein, The World of Marcus Garvey, Race and Class in Modern Society. And her field-shaping article of Mr. Booker T. Washington and Others, The Political Economy of Racism in the United States, which originally appeared in the journal Science and Society in the winter of 1974-75. Stein's work, I just want to say for the record, is pivotal in laying out this approach to black political history, including with her article, Defining the Race 1900 to 1930, which originally appeared in Werner Solers's 1989 collection, The Invention of Ethnicity, and was republished in 2019 as part of a 3-issue non-site commemoration of Stein's work and its impact. Or as I promised, like, the rest of this talk is not going to be a lit survey. But that's done for now. But I wanted to make that point for reasons that I think, or to point out that this scholarship exists for reasons that I hope will be clear. Because it understands the relation between past and present as generative, this approach is also historicist, in that it assumes that the past should be interpreted as much as possible on its own terms, that is, in relation to the specific problems, perspectives, discourses, alliances, cleavages, structures of meaning and feeling that define the center of gravity of the age, and the tensions and contradictions that drove its development. Every historical moment is complex as its own present, and words and ideas can signify quite different, even opposite meanings in different settings, and the connections between one moment and another are seldom linear or direct, nor can they be predicted other than after the fact by the means of a kind of rationalist hubris. Oh, we knew that had to happen. For example, I had fun communicating this point in my teaching by noting that antebellum Democrats' great victory in prosecuting and winning the Mexican War eventuated in the abolition of slavery. You wouldn't think that, would you? Because that's the last thing that they wanted. Here's how it went. The antebellum Democratic Coalition was anchored by middling-level, prosperous Southern planters and Northern white workers who were joined partly by commitment to westward expansion, at one point pumped up as Manifest Destiny, which I'm sure is all too familiar to New Mexicans. Tellingly, slippage between pro-slavery and anti-black racist commitments usefully obscured the contradiction at the core of that alliance. That is, Southern planters favored expansion in order to extend slavery, and white workers wanted it in order to become yeoman freeholders. And it's worth considering that many Northern white workers may have been racist because they were Democrats, as well as the other way around. Benjamin F. Butler, one of the closest things I have to a hero, is I think an illustration of that possibility. Debates over disposition of the territories acquired via the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and a bit of the Gadsden Purchase, right? Forced confrontation of the fundamentally antagonistic reasons that planters and northern workers wanted territorial expansion. That realization fueled growth of anti-slavery sentiment. It encouraged the first two new anti-slavery political parties, Free Soil and the Liberty Party, led to the meltdown of the Whigs as a national party, and then the emergence of a single national anti-slavery the Republican Party that elected Lincoln president in 1860 on an explicitly anti-slavery platform, which in turn forced attempted secession by the slave states and thus created the context for emancipation, right? So that's, and the reason I had fun with that is because like it's a twisted story, but it moved, but it shows that the present is not predictable from the past, right? So recognition of the complexities and unpredictable dynamism of history means that this approach is also contextualist, in that it presumes that events, tendencies, and actors in the past are most usefully or faithfully understood, first synchronically, in relation to contemporary or contemporaneous issues, debates, sensibilities, and pragmatic tensions and relationships. How they may be argued to relate to subsequent or present-day phenomena is most credibly grounded on such contextualist interpretation. If you can pardon the plug, the contributions to our collection, Renewing Black Intellectual History, the Ideological and the Material Foundations of African American Thought, exemplify this approach in relation to the study of Black American intellectual and cultural history, as does my study, W.E.B. Du Bois and American Political Thought, Fabianism and Color Line. Of course, this generative understanding of the relation between past and present also anchors the South, and perhaps, if we have time, we can discuss whether and how that perspective shows up through the text. The other approach is probably a more familiar one to examining the past and its relation to the present, is allegorical. This approach was prominent when we began our reflections on the Jim Crow world, and it's almost all there is now. It goes to the past as a source of often cherry-picked lessons for the present, a trove of inspiring and uplifting stories or anticipations and cautionary tales. The allegorical approach commonly is driven by identifying and celebrating African Americans' contributions, which I think is also a notion that begs interrogation to America or the world or civilization. This reference likely won't be meaningful to many people younger than 50, but I've referred to that variant of the inclination to view history as allegory as the Budweiser Black History Month calendar approach to Black American history. A focus on marking Black accomplishments and firsts. And for those who don't remember, through the 70s and well into the 80s, those calendars, some with themes like Black inventors and inventions or great kings and queens of Africa, adorn liquor stores, barbershops and beauty parlors, restaurants, insurance offices, gas stations, convenience, and mom and pop stores. This focus is a vestige of an earlier and I would argue tragic era when vindication of Black people's capacities was widely seen as an important element of Black American struggle for justice and equality. It also dovetails with and underwrites a sensibility that emerged out of debates over shaping the war on poverty. And the notion that rather than resulting simply from low wages and unemployment, poverty and economic inequality among Black people stem consequentially from demoralization, low self-esteem, and cultural pathologies, as a special sort of black poverty. Liberals typically understood the black pathologies as psychically debilitating effects of racism. Conservatives were more inclined to see them as reflecting intrinsic black racial cultural deficiencies. But both views instructively wind up at the same place, right? As one illustration of the interpretive mischief that history as allegory can enable, this is a point, the point I just made is something that the essayist Ta-Nehisi Coates gets exactly backwards. As he has claimed that the war on poverty failed black Americans because it did not take into account the special nature of black poverty. That's exactly what the war on poverty did, partly in service to justifying partial segmented anti-poverty policies, doing it on the cheap, that is, and is arguably a reason that its programs were inadequate for black Americans as well as everyone else. That moment roughly coincided with the emergence of a largely psychologistic black power discourse, which appropriated what historian Darrell Michael Scott describes as the damage thesis about black Americans for radical seeming ends. It also coincided with the birth of black studies as an academic field, significantly in this context, one that sought its institutional legitimation largely on the basis of what literature scholar Kenneth W. Warren, who is one of the two main communicants who were direct inspirations for It Became the South, and is also, for the record, a Burqueño and a former Highland High School Hornet, just to give the props to the world, characterized it as service to the community, which he argues in part meant an extramural project of serving black people by reconnecting them to the vital traditions and habits presumably being drained from everyday life, end quote. Confluence of these tendencies overdetermined appeal of an allegorical approach to history as a foundation for African Americanist scholarship and public commentary. Now, although history as allegory is rooted in the desire to enhance black Americans' place in the historical record and the broader society, it often comes at an often self-defeating price. In abstracting away from historical specificity in service to potted narratives that may seem to satisfy present-centered concerns, it can impede understanding the complex forces that have shaped black American life. Those narratives can also misconstrue and misrepresent realities of the past and its relation to the present in ways that can be counterproductive for pursuit of the laudable overall socio-political objectives that motivate the approach in the first place. Familiar constructions, for example, the Negro's quest for equality or self-determination, the black freedom struggle, or black liberation movement that stress continuity of black experience across time and context out of concern to emphasize black Americans' persistence in the face of racial obstacles, can homogenize black American history in ways that erase historically specific nuances and dynamic tensions that would be important for making sense of the complexities of contemporary black life. And this, by the way, is in stark contrast to the litany of scholarship that I read off earlier. Some counterproductive consequences of history as allegory do an intellectual disservice mainly to their subject matter, including by not sufficiently insulating interpretive conventions from vulnerability to passing fads. The curious career of W.E.B. Du Bois's double consciousness formulation in his famous book, The Souls of Black Folk, is a case in point. For most of the 20th century, the notion was invoked mainly by social scientists, journalists, and civic actors in place of evidence to support a claim which I characterized in my book on Du Bois as preposterous, and will happily do so again today, that the claim identified a psychological condition of two-ness shared broadly, if not universally, among millions of black Americans. As we used to say back in the day, if a claim like that doesn't qualify as racism, I'm not sure exactly what does. At the same time, the double consciousness formulation was virtually ignored by literary and intellectual historians who actually studied Du Bois's work, and who nearly all considered Du Bois's challenge to Booker T. Washington to be the real centerpiece of the Souls of Black Folk. Whatever. It was not until the late 1980s and the 90s that double consciousness, or that the double consciousness construct suddenly appeared everywhere. Scholars and belletrists, and some of whom alleged high theoretical influences of William James and Ralph Waldo Emerson behind Du Bois's construct, were quickly joined by journalists and others in finding black double consciousness everywhere. Newsweek even diagnosed O.J. Simpson with the condition in discussing his murder case, which ought to say something about the racist foundation of this idea. I argued that a contextual examination of Du Bois's formulation showed that it resonated with the sensibility widely expressed among his cohort of largely Northeastern, turn-of-the-century elite intellectuals. I argued further that a common root for them all was embrace of the premises of a particular form of the nature-culture dichotomy that was also linked to late Victorian neo-Lamarckian race theory, which Du Bois accepted in 1897 when he initially published the essay Of Our Spiritual Strivings, in which the formulation appears, and presumably in 1903 when Souls was published, but explicitly abandoned shortly thereafter. Now, the point here is not that my interpretation is better, although I do believe it is because it's richer and the most plausible on textualist grounds, that is, that it fits best with a close reading of Du Bois's arguments across the trajectory of his career. And frankly, like what we're supposed to be doing in this biz, I'm going to say a little bit more about that in a second, more concretely in a second, is insofar as we produce these accounts for communities of scholars who work in general areas, then we are trying to generate accounts that are better or richer or more plausible than others. So it's not. So it's kind of a dumbass sophistry. I hate to put it that way, but to say, well, that's just your opinion, right? Right. I mean, that works in a barbershop. It shouldn't even work in a barbershop anyway. But anyway, but I think that my reading is better on contextualist grounds also. But you know, ultimately, that's a beef between me and other historians of ideologies or political thought. Although I will say, can't let the bone go, I think my interpretation is preferable to the extent that the objective is to produce accounts that strive for historicist credibility, but not so much if the objective is to construct a usable past for presentist purposes, right? So that's the pluralist aspect of this. However, as I also argue in the Du Bois book, appropriation of the past ahistorically to support presentist claims is not as innocent of historicism as the practice's adherents would contend. When one appropriates a facet of the past to buttress the proposition about the present, one is in fact making an at least tacit claim regarding the historical significance of the aspect of the past that one is appropriating. In principle, therefore, such claims, even if made for entirely presentist purposes, as if Marcus Garvey were alive today, he'd be a communist, should be subject to the same standards of evaluation for historical accuracy or plausibility as those advanced on explicitly historicist scholarly grounds. Anyway, what's important about this case with regard to my talk today is that by the end of the 1980s, the community service orientation in Black studies, as embodied, for example, in the emergent category of the Black public intellectual, had become so prominent that it severed its moorings to critical debates among scholarly specialists about the quality of competing interpretations, and became articulated more and more toward public relations and pursuit of career strategies that leverage fame and visibility in the world of public chatter outside the scholarly community for advancement within the academy. As those moorings are severed, restraints on claims one can plausibly make recede in relation to the benefits that visibility in the broad public realm can bestow. This dynamic encourages projection of large, simplistic assertions renderable as easily digestible sound bites, often asserting expose, of deeper truths that supposedly theretofore have been ignored, denied, or suppressed by scholars. For example, claims that the point of the American Revolution and even the 13th Amendment expressly crafted to abolish slavery was in fact to preserve the institution, right? Severing the moorings of scholarly restraint also in blurring distinctions between scholarship and autodidacticism diminishes the importance of scholarly expertise as a basis for credibility in advancing such claims. In fact, lack of formal expertise can be its own basis for authority, not unlike the clickbait ads we all see with headlines like, "What doctors don't want you to know about how to cure diabetes," right? A parallel move propelling bombastic, dubious assertions concerning Black American history is the proclamation of things we weren't taught about slavery's role in American history, or the even more accusatory, why wasn't I taught about slavery? As historian James Oakes points out in What the 1619 Project Got Wrong, a very powerful recent critique in the journal Catalyst, if you didn't learn about slavery's central role in American history in college in the last 50 years, it's most likely because you didn't take a U.S. history course or didn't do the reading or go to class. And I would add also, unless you went to Bob Jones or to Liberty, Hillsdale, or like some other right-wing, college. In this environment, questionable or flatly erroneous and ahistorical interpretations have had much broader impact. I've already mentioned Coates's exactly wrong characterization of the War on Poverty's premises concerning Black poverty, which led him to misdiagnose sources of and therefore proposed inadequate remedies for Black economic inequality in the present. 13therism, or the argument that the 13th Amendment did not abolish slavery, but included a poison pill in its exception for, quote, punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, end quote, that supposedly enabled the institution's rebirth as mass incarceration, demonstrates the mischief that what Darrell Scott described in a 2022 article, The Scandal of 13therism in Liberties magazine, as bad history can encourage. This claim, which rose to widely held common sense in the wake of Ava DuVernay's 2016 documentary 13th, is based entirely on a tendentious and frankly historically uninformed, naively textualist reading of the amendment, combined with just so stories and at least, but not always only, implicit conspiracy theory that, as Scott notes, brings to mind the devil theories of the Nation of Islam. Scott and historian Sean Rolentz, in a December 22 New York Review of Books article called The Emancipator's Vision, have cataloged the many inadequacies and historical misreadings on which this claim depends. And I highly recommend reading both those articles. One failing that Rolentz indicates, to which autodidacts, or the self-taught or the lay practitioners, may be particularly vulnerable, is what he describes as imputing causes from results. But in all fairness to autodidacts, the culprit to whom Rolentz refers as the triply Harvard degreed full professor at Tufts, so I guess that may not work. The 13th case, in line with interpretive tendencies like Afrofuturism and Afropessimism, that willfully break with strictures of temporality and chronology to facilitate telling a desirable story, often seems to have later events causing earlier ones, and persistently presses historically erroneous claims on the ground of exposing a truthier truth. As Scott argues, kind of ironically, this rejection of the integrity of historical truth is at odds with more than a century of Black American intellectual life, which hinged on conviction that historical accuracy was a handmaiden of the struggle for racial justice and equality. So interventions like the 1619 Project and 13therism are darker expressions of the practice of attending to the past for allegorical purposes. They are extreme extensions of a disposition to abjure historical complexity out of commitment to producing accounts of unremitting brutalization and oppression of Black people at the hands of, quote, whites or an abstract white supremacy, which sometimes, frankly, seems like oppression porn. This tendency militates against nuanced historical understanding as in a moralizing inclination to reduce slavery and Jim Crow to what my historian son exasperatedly describes as white people's permanent sadistic camp for Blacks. He also noted that in recent years, undergraduates, both Black and otherwise, take issue with description of slavery as a labor system, as though thus describing it makes light of slave suffering and the moral opprobrium that the institution merits. And they resist considering whether it's accurate as an historical characterization. The Professor Barbara Jean Fields has remarked similarly that much current discussion of slavery presumes that its point was to produce white supremacy, not cotton, cane, rice, or indigo. She has also observed that if racism were the cause and purpose of Black slavery, a much simpler solution to racial aversion would have been simply to leave Blacks an ocean away in Africa. So the punchline of these darker allegorical accounts is that nothing has ever changed Black American circumstances meaningfully, and that moreover efforts to make things better have only made them worse. A bracing early encounter I had with this interpretive inclination came in the 1990s when I was teaching a fairly large enrollment, which I remember because it's one of those courses where I had to lecture from the stage. Black politics course. My lecture was on the 30 years of contestation between emancipation and the descent of the Jim Crow order. And I noted that the sharecrop system took shape as a compromise, although one that reflected the asymmetrical power of the planters and the tenant farmers, but a compromise between the free people's desires to work on their own without immediate planter supervision and the landowner's preference for instituting a labor system as close as they could get to slavery. My point was that to that extent, the sharecrop system, though hardly ideal, was something of an improvement for Black Southerners. An earnestly perplexed undergrad raised her hand and noted that her professor, whom she named, in an African American studies course, had insisted that sharecropping and the Jim Crow regime were indeed worse than slavery for free people. So I was flummoxed, partly because of the constraining guild imperative to avoid criticizing or disparaging a colleague in front of students, but also because I couldn't for the life of me understand what objective would justify imposing such a defeatist and inaccurate argument onto the students. And it was one that hardly qualifies as inspirational or shows regard for actual Black people's agency, which is another shibboleth, as we know, of the history as allegory tendency. Fast forward roughly 2 decades, and at a similar encounter, but with an adult presumably credentialed historian, who, like the undergrad, was fully, who, unlike the undergrad actually, was fully committed to a version of that nothing ever gets better for black people narrative. On a 2015 panel at the Southern Historical Association convention, I gave a presentation on the biracial / interracial character of, and frankly, that's a distinction that didn't really mean that much in racial history or black history prior to the Plessy decision, which gave segregation its political salience. I can say more about that too if anybody's interested. But yeah, my talk was on the biracial and interracial character of the late 19th century populist insurgency, and I discussed its violent suppression, including the vicious 1898 Democratic putsch against the twice elected populist Republican fusion government in North Carolina. After the panel, sorry, I jumped ahead of myself. Help. Right. After the panel, which was organized in honor of SHA President Barbara Fields, and by the way, it was after this panel when Professor Fields and I had the discussion that led to her asking with some enthusiasm to see the too long for an article, too short for a book draft that eventually, in no small measure because of her support, became the South. But anyway, after the panel, an attendee approached to catechize me with no trace of hostility on the point that the real story of the defeat of populism was the fact that white farmers and workers forsook alliance with blacks for the appeal of white supremacy. I allowed that no doubt was part of the story, but reminded her of the centrality of the campaign of rampant violence, fraud, outright theft, murder, and intimidation waged against the insurgents, white and black, throughout the region before and after 1892. Her response, cavalierly sloughing off my qualification, was, yes, there was that too, but the real explanation for the defeat was whites' commitment to racism. Okay. It would be interesting to reconstruct precisely how the history as allegory approach came to be dominated by the profoundly defeatist and race reductionist nothing has changed narrative. For now, I want to underscore that the dark expression of the approach has become hegemonic. By the end of the 20-teens, as the broad popularity of 1619-ism and 13th-erism, among other interpretive pathologies, indicates, it was the standard template even for celebratory, inspirational, uplifting tale type, right? So extraordinary black figures are now even more extraordinary because they rise from and at least momentarily overcome unrelenting suppression from all quarters, all the time, by whites who seemingly exist to embody a sadistic white supremacy with the occasional white ally who seemingly exists to embody plausible deniability against the charge that this story demonizes whites racially. Considering the shifting ideological environment within which the premises of African American history as allegory have evolved may offer clues to the rise of the nothing has changed perspective. Already in the 1980s, black opinion-shaping strata in general emphasized projecting positive images about and for black Americans, presumably to counter their damage by racism and cultural pathology, as an important element of strategy for blacks' advancement. Although few acknowledged it, this turn was an accommodation to the bipartisan, national, and local policy regime of retrenchment and austerity that took shape during the Carter presidency and intensified during the Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Bush, Obama years. Positive racial image ideology, that is, was the black alternative to redistributive and social wage policies. It also amounted to positing individualist solutions to quintessentially collective problems. As I've discussed elsewhere, for example, in a 2018 Bachelor essay, The Trouble with Uplift, this positive image discourse metastasized over the 1990s and into the current century, to a point at which projection of black heroes overwhelmed concern with historical accuracy. As the boundaries between academic and popular spheres blurred, the logic of the latter increasingly set the agenda of the former. For instance, scholars closed ranks around Ava DuVernay's defense of her Selma film's consequential falsification of the history of the Selma campaign in service to the higher purpose of not risking depiction of President Lyndon Johnson as a white savior, even though her imposing that license really undermines the way that we understand how the Voting Rights Act was formulated, fought for, and won. Quentin Tarantino's, or similarly, scholars lauded Django Unchained, Quentin Tarantino's cartoonish homage to the spaghetti western, as a more desirable depiction of emancipation. Perfect. As a more desirable depiction of emancipation than Spielberg's Lincoln. Others have endorsed the fantasy world created in Ryan Coogler's superhero film Black Panther, which Coogler calls a fable of black empowerment as an aspirational truth that is thereby truthier than black Americans' existing realities. This willingness, if not demand, to subordinate the factual world to ostensibly self-satisfying fantasy helps make clear how people who should know better clearly, and that includes scholars, succumb to absurdities like 13therism or Afro-pessimism that are manifestly false on most cursory inspection. Now, there's an element of something like class-skewed moral panic driving this bizarre turn as well. 40 years of positive image ideology's failure as an antidote to steadily intensifying inequality and material insecurity across the society among black Americans and others calls forth simultaneously a doubling down on asserting its realer reality and a necessary, though once again unacknowledged, accommodation to its failure. As the bromides of the positive images, Horatio Alger stories become less and less tenable as guides for individual success, even with proliferation of supportive popular mystifications like prosperity gospel or sacralizing contingent precarious employment as entrepreneurialism. Sustaining the fantasy as popular ideology requires ever more dependence on magical thinking.